This is a live question and answer session with the Midwest Organic Consultants at the Rodale Institute. My name is Nick Podal. I'm one of the organic consultants in the Midwest. I specialize in small grains and vegetable production, and I'm located in Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Verik, and I was one of the Midwest Organic Consultants until I moved to Boulder, Colorado a month ago. Prior to joining Rodale, I worked for the University of Wisconsin-Madison with Dr. Erin Silva on organic and sustainable row crop production. So doing research in reducing tillage in row crop production and increasing cover crop use. And we don't have a lot of people today, but housekeeping items. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand if you want to say the question out loud, and we will unmute you. You cannot unmute yourself. That's pretty much it. If you want to start by introducing yourself in the chat, that would be nice, so we have an idea of who is there. Although I already have a pretty good idea of who is there. Why don't you all go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat? That's your first thing to do. And since it's a live Q&A, we would want to have questions from you. So please go ahead and ask questions in the Q&A sections. And I wanted to start by tossing it to you all. And ask you which of those 4 sample questions that we came up with, in case no one had questions, which one would you want to like to see covered first? I'm not sure we're going to have time for all of them. We could, but let's see which one you want to have covered first. So please type a number in the chat. Okay. There is a question in the Q&A, which is, what is current research ongoing at the Midwest Organic Center? That's a great question. Oh, and someone has his chat disabled, so I don't know if Justin, you can solve that problem. But yeah, I can tackle what research is ongoing at the Midwest Organic Center. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Midwest Organic Center, it's one of the satellite research sites from the Rodale Institute that's situated in Marion, Iowa, which is north of Cedar Rapids, which is in eastern Iowa. And the center has been conducting research for 3 years, I think, at this point, which, it always takes a while to establish research, but what's going on now? This year, we had a project with organic black beans in rolled down rye. There has been a lot of research in rolled down rye and organic soybeans planted into it, the organic no-till system, but we wanted to grow food instead of feed and decided to try planting black beans in the rolled down rye. One of the limitations with black beans is that something that had been observed prior was that they're not as competitive and may need a little more nitrogen than soybeans do, at least in the early stages. So that's something we wanted to look at, whether they would actually grow through the rye or not. And one thing that we did to help those black beans grow is to add pelletized poultry manure to the black beans as we were planting them. So we planted the rye November 25th or 20th, and then in the spring, early summer, early June, we came back to trim the rye, plant the black beans into it on 30 inches, and apply pelletized poultry manure on it to help them go. So that was one of the research projects that was going on. We also had something with corn. We wanted to see the corn response to different rates of pelletized poultry manure. I think it's a big question for organic growers, how much manure do I need to apply? And I think it also, it will really much depends on the crop rotation that you have, how much of a response you will get from the corn. But we wanted to see in those specific circumstances, what would a response of the corn to 3 different rates of pelletized poultry manure. We had kind of a failed trial in that same corn area. We wanted to see if we could decrease the need for mechanical weeding in season by planting buckwheat with the corn a week or so after planting the corn. So we would till the field, plant the corn, drill buckwheat into it a week or so after, and then supposedly have nothing else to do. So that would eliminate row cultivation completely. Unfortunately, we had drill issues and couldn't plant the buckwheat on time. This has been done by a farmer in Minnesota who had like pretty promising results from that system. So not only it reduces cultivation, but it also increases diversity, and buckwheat being a great pollinator, I think it would be a great system. Who provided the pelletized poultry manure? We bought it from a company in Iowa, which I think they're called Clarion, if I remember properly. But I would have to get back to you on that to get the details. Nick, do you want to go into the diversity trial?
I don't recall which one that was right off the top of my head.
Yeah, all the different crops that we tried.
Gosh, I can't remember what they are right now.
Yeah, I can't remember all of them either, but in order to we would like to establish like a long-term cropping system trial at the MOC, just like we have on main campus in Pennsylvania. And for that, we want to have like an increased, more diverse cropping system than a corn, soybean, small grain, which is like the typical Midwestern crop rotation. And so we are trialing a bunch of different crops that are like minor crops or niche crops that are not grown by a lot of growers. And we're trying, which one grows best, which one would fit best in such a long-term, cropping system trial. And so this year, I think we had sunflowers, we had buckwheat, I believe. I think there was millet as well in there. And we're going to try, over the next couple of years in our sandbox, we're going to try to grow these crops and try to grow them in different ways. And we're also going to have winter crops. I think we have winter barley, winter wheat, probably. I can't remember which like fun, more diverse and niche crop we have as a fall crop. But again, we have summer crop, fall crops, and spring crops that are underused, not very common crops in the Midwest. And that's more like learning how to grow them and seeing the ones that fit best for a long-term cropping system trial, that it is, again, more diverse than a corn, soybean, wheat rotation.
I remember now we did some amaranth as well. So we planted a trial of amaranth, and we're going to do a seed increase on what was planted there, and hopefully plant a larger amount than what we did this year, and see how that can fit into cropping systems as well. So.
And I always forget that one, but it's a really great one. It's just that I don't work with vegetables a lot, but there's a really nice vegetable trial that has been going on though for, I think this year was the 3rd year. And they're looking at different tillage options, or, black plastic or no black plastic, tillage, no tillage, with different crop sequences. They have spring vegetables, summer vegetables, and fall vegetables that go in sequence, 2 by 2. And they also have in this trial plants that help with pest control. I think they use basil in one of them. They use marigold, I believe, in one of them. So they're looking at, a bunch of different things with vegetables. And yeah, it's a great one. And I think, the research will probably be published the sooner because it's been going on for so long and they have data on it at this point.
Yeah, we're starting some agroforestry stuff there as well. I think this year they just planted some cover crop on that ground. They had a mixture of some leftover seed of cowpea and millet and sorghum, and maybe some soybean as well. And I think they just baled that off. And then I think that's going to be going into the agroforestry project that we're going to be working on later as well. So we're kind of working with some folks from the Savannah Institute on that. And I think they're going to look at like alley cropping some grains within within some forestry crops like chestnuts or elderberries or hazelnuts, something like that. So
Yeah, and I believe the understory in that agroforestry system is said to be Kernza, so there might be some
okay,
Kernza going on at the MOC. So a bunch of different things happening there. Thanks for the question. I think, yeah, we don't really cover that publicly a lot, and I think that's, yeah, great to like set the stage. Is the chat, I hope that the chat issue is resolved. And if it is, if you all can introduce yourself in the chat saying, you know, where you work physically and which kind of company, or if you're self-employed, what type of work do you do? That would be nice. And also, if you see on my screen, we have like 4 questions here. And if you can vote on which one you would prefer to see answered first. And if we still have a chat issue, then I'm just going to go ahead with the first question. Or you can also answer in the Q&A because that seems to be working. Okay, I'm hearing that it still is disabled, which is unfortunate. All right, I will let Justin, or who is assisting with the tech side today, resolve that issue, and I'm just going to dive into the weed control part. So this is, I still don't have the date of it. I love that somewhat old publication that has different definition of what a weed is according to different type of people. I'm trying to get my pointer here. So we have three different categories of people. We have a professional weed man. Maybe that's an agronomy professor, a weed science professor, an enthusiastic amateur. I'm gonna let you imagine who that could be. And an ecology minded, sorry. So the weed man doesn't like the weeds. They're not wanted, they're obnoxious, they're plant out of place. That's, you know, that's one way to see it. And I think that's the way conventional agriculture has seen it since, you know, chemicals are existing in our systems. The enthusiastic amateur is more, you know, willing to understand that they can contribute to a thing, you know, a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. I think, you know, that's fair to put it that way. As Nick was mentioning, we are growing amaranth, which is also called pigweed in some instances at the MOC, because in addition to being a weed, amaranth family has crops that are crops for grain and are actually really good food values for humans and used in all sorts of granola and seed mixes or bread as well. And the ecologic minded obviously just like the weeds more and more. They're a pioneer of a secondary succession of which the weedy arable field is a special case. They're camp followers, you know, they're like more beneficial. And I think as organic farmers, you know, we should set the stage by being somewhere here and not too much there, or else we're just kind of drive ourselves kind of crazy. So 2 steps of weed management, and then being like very, you know, step back, big picture. So there are kind of 2 steps of it. You want to reduce the weed emergence by using preventive methods, crop rotation, cover crops, post-harvest and pre-plant tillage, and so on. And then once, you know, the crops are in the field, it's time to act. You know, want to reduce the weed competition through cultural methods that improve the crop competitive ability, fertility, crop genotype, seeding patterns, direct weed control, which is also called mechanical weeding. Crop rotation, again, you know, is a big way to decrease weed pressure. I think it's your #1 tool to decrease weed pressure. You want to limit the opportunities for the best adapted weed species to increase by driving the weeds crazy. You know, they don't know how next year is going to look like, if it's going to be a winter crop, a spring crop, a summer crop, a grain crop, a root crop, a crop that sucks up a lot of nutrients like corn, or crops that builds nutrients somehow like soybeans, something that's planted in row, that's plain. they want to have their world kind of shaken every year, and even like every season, I want to say. And there is a term in French that I haven't seen the direct translations here. I would call it the rotations head or break crop, which is a crop that really provides diversity, reduces pest and disease and weed pressure, and improves soil quality. So alfalfa is an amazing rotation head, amazing break crop, because it does all of this. It's not necessarily the crop that's going to bring the highest revenue, but I think on the long term, it is the crop that brings it the highest revenue by making the other crops grow better. I'm going to hand it off to Nick for that next slide.
So yeah, when you start thinking about crop rotation, I think it's helpful to sort of break it down into the season type that the crop is going to be occupying. So in the previous slide, I mentioned winter crops, and then spring or cool season crops, and then warm or summer annual crops. And so, and then the head of the rotation is in there as well. And so you start with the head of the rotation. Those are typically your soil building years that I've referred to them as here. And they could be something like alfalfa, like we mentioned, or sweet clover is another good one to use in organic systems. And then after that, you would typically terminate those crops in the late summer. And so then after that, in keeping with the idea of having a living root in the ground as much as possible, you would want to go to like a winter annual in that sequence, I think, first. And from there, you can sort of work through some different ways to do it. And I've kind of listed out one here, but so you would go to a winter annual like winter wheat or triticale, maybe rye, if you were growing that for some cover crop seed or something like that. But after harvest of that, then you could go to a warm season annual. And in this instance, it would be like soybeans or buckwheat, something that doesn't necessarily require a lot of fertility at this point in the rotation. Buckwheat would have an opportunity to undersow sweet clover again. So you'd be going back into a soil building year the next year in this type of sequence. And so you could go with sweet clover again. If you went with soybeans the year before, then maybe you'd go with like a sorghum Sudan grass mix the next year that would be planted in the middle of the year. And then after that, you would go to a spring or a cool season annual, like oats or barley or spring wheat. And then following that, you would have a manure application in the last year of this rotation or sequence, and you would have a summer or warm season annual, probably either corn or millet. And then again, with the small grains, you have an opportunity to underseed clover. So you could do millet with sweet clover here and then run back around to the top of the rotation. If you did corn and you had good weed control in it, you would have the possibility of maybe doing another warm season annual to extend the rotation a little bit. So you could maybe do another year of soybeans or something after the corn here before you head back around into something like alfalfa. So this is just a kind of a way to think about sequencing, but you can see each of those three types of crops are represented in this rotation. So you have the winter annuals, the cool season, and the warm season. And it's important to have all three of those in the rotation in order to, like Leah was saying, keep the weeds sort of guessing. And it's really important for weed control. I should also mention, I do have like 2 soil building years in this sequence, and the middle one, that sorghum Sudan grass mix, also provides kind of an opportunity in there to introduce livestock into the rotation and do some grazing of that crop as well. Another way to add some value to those rotation heads or soil building years in the rotation. So,
thanks, Nick. We're already gone over this one. This is a piece of research that I like to present as well, conducted in 2009 by Smith and al. And it's all it's a lot of graph and somewhat complicated, but not too complicated. So let's take a pick at it. So here we have the corn yield, and here we have the wheat biomass. Here we have the soybean yield, the wheat biomass, the wheat yield, and the wheat biomass. And they're looking at two different crop rotations, which are the two lines that you see here. So the discontinued line here has 36 crop, and the continued line has 1 to 2 crop, and it's the same for all the graphs. So in the corn, we see as the wheat biomass increases, the corn yield actually increases in the more diverse crop rotation. I would call it, that's probably not a significant increase. I would call it stable towards increase. And in the shorter crop rotation, it is more like stable towards decrease. Same here, if we go to the soybeans, as the wheat biomass, the wheat pressure increases, you see that really the very low diversity crop rotation was only 1 to 2 crop really decreases pretty steadily. Here, we would call it more like stable to decrease. So the highest number of crop, the more resilient your system is against weeds. And kind of similar trend here for the winter wheat, where as the wheat pressure increases, the less diverse crop rotation, then the wheat yield decreases a lot, and it's more stable in the more diverse crop rotation. So I think that's like a great news and very encouraging, and I would say hopefully encourages farmers to really consider this longer crop rotation. I think us as consultants always advocate for the longer the better in terms of crop rotation. I know it can be a challenge to like market all those crops, and that's also something we can help you with. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions on that aspect as well. But yeah, I think this is pretty fascinating research. I'm going to skip the wheat biology part and go to the one tip on in-row weed control. So this was shared with me by Joel Griver at Western Illinois University, and he's done this for a couple of years. I don't have the most updated results. He's done it further than 2018. And so one thing that he did, weed control in soybean is notoriously complicated. They're not very competitive like corn. Corn grows pretty tall quite fast. Soybeans stay kind of small. They close canopy eventually because they get bushy and leafy, but it takes a while, and weed control can be very complicated, particularly in the row where you don't really have any option past the rotary hoe tine weeding window. So one thing that he tried to do is to kind of create a furrow in the row at planting with the residue manager on the planter set very aggressively. So by creating that furrow, he kind of left room to bury the wheat seeds in the row as he does his tine weeding and rotary hoeing. And he's actually seen great results. So that's only 2018, only 1 year, but I think he's seen great results afterwards. Please, reach out to us if you want more. We can put you in touch with him. So in the aggressive setting, he saw a 65 average yield. This is Illinois, so the yields are pretty high in general. And he saw, almost 10 bushels less with the no aggressive, just the standard planting. I wish there was the wheat pressure here, but there was no data. There was just an image to show how the wheat pressure was higher in the standard residue management compared to the aggressive residue management. So by making that furrow and allowing for more burial of the wheat seeds in the row, he really improved the weed control in the row here. That's kind of a good tip from him. One of the sections that I wanted to cover here is what do I need to buy? And I think that's a question that we get fairly often by growers in the Midwest who are going to grow organic grain, a diversity of organic grains that have a diversity of planting patterns versus whether they're row crops like corn and soybeans, or they're plain planting crops like winter wheat. And I like to use this little chart. So I translated this charts from a French extension publication, and I think they're really great. And as I was working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and doing the weed control, I kind of stuck to those rows, because when you're into it, you can't look for 20,000 different sources of information that's going to get you confused, frustrated. worried. So I just printed those little cheat sheets. And when it was time to do the weed control, I would just kind of follow them. So what we're seeing here is just the general effectiveness of different tools at different stages of the weed development. So you can see the row cultivator is pretty effective on pretty big, pretty large weeds. So up to 3 leaves, past 3 leaves, they're like really deeply rooted. So unless you really hit them, with the shank, right with the tip of the shank, then it's going to be hard to control them. Not impossible, but harder. And you kind of go down the list here. The tine weeder can have, some effectiveness up to 1 leaf. I wouldn't go past, in that low efficiency. Anything that's bigger than 1 leaf, unless your tine weeder is set very aggressively, in which case you may damage your crop, you're not going to see a lot of kill of the weeds. And a rotary hoe has even a shorter window of efficacy against weeds. So anything that's bigger than cotyledon stage is not going to be effectively controlled by a rotary hoe. And here you see it for the types of weeds. So annual broadleaves, they're pretty easy to control. Not something that I worry too much about. Grasses are not that easy. Foxtail is the one that comes to mind. That's kind of a big problem for everyone. Not a lot of good efficiency with those, plain full width mechanical weed control means. The row cultivator can take them out. And perennials, it's just not something that can be controlled with rotary hoe, tine weeder, or row cultivator. And the chart also has, and again, reach out to us. There will be our contact at the end of it, or you can just reach out to our general consulting email. If you want those charts, I have them for different crops as well. So just here as an example, the use of a tine weeder in corn. So you kind of have the wheat stage, the speed at which you should go with the implement, how aggressive you should set it, and what is the risk of crop loss. And this is about the crop. So before emergence of the crop, after emergence of the crop at 3 to 4 leaves and 4 to 6 leaves. And those are, like, as I was describing to you, those are the charts that I kind of would stick to. And I would just go there and how big are the weeds? How big is the crop? And what tool can I use? And that's how I would make my decisions and really stick to those roles. And the same here for the soybeans. Each crop is going to be different. So again, feel free to ask us for those charts. I'm more than happy to share them if that can help you. Another thing that can be, we talked about, setting the aggressivity of your tool, making sure you have your tool is in great shape and you have the right type, because within tine weeder, within rotary hoe, and within row cultivator, you have 10 types of each, and it can be very overwhelming to pick the right one because they can also be very expensive. They're great resources that we can point you towards, and one of them is Gary McDonald. Gary McDonald is kind of a row cultivation guru. He's just very good at it. He's very good at giving advice on it. I think he's a consultant himself, so he can come to your farm and help you set your cultivator the right way, help you use the right cultivator at the right time. So really don't hesitate to go on YouTube and watch this video series about how to set a cultivator by Gary McDonald, or give him a call, or find other resources. All right, that was it for the how do I control weeds section. Nick, do you have anything to add for how to control weeds? And any question on that? Oh, the chat is working now.
Yeah, I think, what I would add is just to pay attention a little bit to the weeds that you have on your farm too, and what specific weeds that you're having the most trouble with. And try to figure out how you control those culturally first, before you start worrying about what machinery to use and spending money on machinery. I think there are some ways that generally you can figure out how to better control certain weeds without spending money first, with just a little bit of planning. And again, that's something that we can help you with too. If anybody's struggling with certain weeds, and then we might think about going to certain implements or something like that. So there's sort of a, I guess, a hierarchy of options that you go to first on that. So
Thank you. So the next, since, it's a pretty small crowd, we don't have a ton of questions. We're just going to go through the motions and go through those 4 questions that I presented in the first slides. So this one is a question that sets us up, and we are asked very often in the Midwest, is how do I go from a conventional no-till system to an organic no-till system? That's a tough question because I don't think anyone has cracked the nut of a complete organic no-till system. And there are a lot of advantages to tillage. There are a lot of benefits to tillage. There are also a lot of detrimental effects of tillage. There is good tillage, there is bad tillage, there is good timing, there is bad timing, there is using the right tool at the right time is what really we have to think about. What are we trying to achieve? I think it's good that each farmer, as they're going through the motions of their crop rotation, think about, why am I tilling? And could I not till here until then instead, and skip one pass by doing that? Really ask yourselves every time you're tilling, why am I doing it? Could I avoid it? Could I use a tool that's less disruptive? But also keep in mind that you have to have a system that works, and you can't let your system be overtaken by weeds, or you cannot have the issue of having a poor nutrient cycling because your soil is not, your green manure, your manure is not incorporated properly. So a lot of things to balance with tillage. And one thing that I wanted to show here is the Rodale farming system trials. So it's been going on for 40 years, I think. Don't quote me on that. Unfortunately, this is recorded, but I don't think it's a terrible mistake to miss a couple of years here. But it's been going on for a very long time. It's one of the oldest side-by-side comparison between organic and conventional systems. And it has 3 main systems: the conventional, the organic legume, which doesn't have any nitrogen input other than green manure, which is cover crop incorporation. And the third one is organic with manure. So it is organic and also has manure added to it as a source of nutrient for the crops. The rotations are getting longer as you go to the right here. So the conventional is a corn, soybean, which is actually a pretty conventional, classic conventional rotation. The organic legume has a corn, oats, soy, wheat. And there are a bunch of cover crops that are into it, rye, clover, hairy vetch. The conventional has no cover crop. And the organic manure is even longer because it's a system in which you would think the animals, are on the farm. And so you can grow hay to feed your cattle. So corn, oats, soy, wheat, 3 years of hay, corn, and wheat again. So it's a much longer rotation. Again, synthetic inputs in the conventional, 0 inputs in the legume one, and composted manure, sorry, there's a typo here, in the organic manure one. And the areas of research into systems are yields, because farmers always want to have yield, understandably, but also soil health, environmental quality, and economics. And one thing that's very interesting is that in 2008, all 3 systems were divided into a full till and a reduced till system. So for each, conventional, organic legume, organic manure, all the plots were split in half. And for the conventional, it was full till versus reduced till. I'm pretty sure that's actually no till here, not reduced till. And full till versus reduced till in organic. Okay, and reduced in different ways in conventional and organic system. Naturally, in conventional, the way it's achieved is, as you can see here, was Roundup. That's how you can afford to not till, is by spraying. And yeah, I'm pretty sure this would be like a full no-till system. And after 2008, so 12 years. I'm terrible at mathematics. So it's been a while. So a lot of years into it, they have measured a bunch of metrics, and here is one of them. So the soil tillage intensity rating, and that here solves the issue of reduced till versus no-till. So you can see that the conventional tillage is actually pretty much a no-till system. And the reduced till, and in the organic system, it's a reduced till, not a no-till. And so you can see that the soil tillage intensity rating is near 0 in the no-till conventional one. But then in the organic systems, it's much lower than it is in the full till system, but it's not 0. And there are good reasons for that that I already mentioned, weed control, nutrient management. But still reduced tillage by 35%, which is already a great step in the right direction. And what have they seen? So microbial biomass. Everyone likes to hear about microbes. Everyone cares about microbes now, which is great. We know more and more every day, but maybe the more we know, the less we know about microbes and their effect and who should be there and should not be there and in what amounts. It's pretty complicated, but here are pretty straightforward metrics that include microbes. So that's the microbial biomass carbon at 3 different depths. So microbial biomass carbon, it's the microbial biomass. It's how much microbes is there per kilogram of soil. So how many milligrams of microbial carbon per kilogram of soil. If you look at the top 10 centimeters, we're comparing, the till, the no-till. There's not a big difference in the top. And there is not a big difference in the top between systems. We see that the manure system is like trending a little higher here. And that's, to be expected. Manure adds, different things to the system. We're feeding the microbes a more diverse diet by not only adding cover crops, but also adding manure. That's a different, it's a processed kind of plant material. As you go deeper in the soil profile, we still don't see a lot of differences between the till and the no-till. But we start seeing differences between the systems, and we see the conventional has lower microbial biomass compared to the legume and the manure. Manure is still trending a little upwards of all of them. And same as we go deeper, so the deeper we go, and the more striking the differences are between the system. So even with this system that has 0 tillage at all, compared to those systems that still have tillage, you can still achieve a pretty higher microbial biomass by having an organic system with tillage than a conventional without tillage at all. We're talking here about the same systems, different metrics. So this is the respiration of the microbes, which measures their activity. If you think about humans, it's the same. The more we breathe, the more we're active. So they're measuring how much they breathe, actually, or respire is more of the term here. So you can see comparing again the conventional, the legume, the manure, and breaking it down between reduced till and no-till and till. A little bit of an increased sort of respiration within the conventional system when you stop tilling. That's very to be expected. A little lower respiration, but you can see B and B here means that they're actually not significantly different. So roughly the same amount of respiration between the conventional and the legume organic system. And here you see A, higher respiration in the manure system. And think about it, we're feeding them a more diverse diet. And just as us, the more diverse diet we eat, the healthier we are. Measuring compaction. So again, the same systems, tilled, not tilled, tilled, reduced till, tilled, reduced till. So we can see that the compaction depth to 300 psi is shallower in conventional than it is in organic. Even the no-till system, you still see the compaction depth is much lower in the conventional system without tillage than it is in the organic systems, even including tillage. So reduced tillage causes more compaction in the conventional system, but not in organic systems. And that's kind of a whole other kind of worm, but picking a good soil health lab test is very complicated, and I think one of the ones that has come as the broader used one is the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment Soil Health, which if you use the acronym is CASH, so that's kind of an easy one to remember. It's a pricey one, but so far I think the one that is the most comprehensive. And so if we look at, again, those same three systems, overall the soil health score is equivalent between the conventional and the legume, and is higher in the manure system. So I think all that we've been seeing here is a tilled system, organic can still achieve optimized soil health, and manure adds quite a bit of diversity to the diets of the microbes and then their biomass and activity. I'm going to skip those ones. And Nick, do you have anything to add? I feel like I kind of took a tangent between answering how do I go from a no-till conventional to an organic system, and I think my approach here was that tillage is not that bad. So Nick, if you have anything to add.
I would just add that, a few things about some of the implements. I think it's important on an organic farm to have access to a pretty full suite of tillage implements. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to use them all every year, but they're important to have in different situations where you don't have, using a chemical to control the weeds in any situation. So there's different soil conditions that require different types of tillage and different timing. And so having a variety of tilling implements becomes important in an organic system. And I think a disc and a chisel plow are both pretty indispensable tools. I think you need to have kind of both of those to use at different times. And I would say in using them as well, especially with the chisel plow, you want to practice as slow as tillage as possible. Try not to till when it's too wet, so you're not slabbing any soil. But even when you are tilling, practicing tillage that keeps residues on the surface as much as you can, or as much as is necessary, and then doing it as slow as possible. There's a big impact with, we always talk about the physical impact of tillage, but there's a big difference between really slow and mellow types of tillage. Even if you were doing with a moldboard plow, you think about the Amish farmers who are moldboard plowing with a horse or something. They're really turning that soil over very gently. And there's very low physical impact in terms of force that's applied to the soil. And so when we're running through the soil with steel implements pulled by a tractor, there can be a tremendous amount of force there. And lowering the amount of force that you're applying to the soil makes a big difference in the impact of tillage as well.
Ooh. Nick, do you want to tackle the question? Are there any special considerations when applying manure in a no-till cover crop system?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful with it. And it's much less effective actually as well, because if you're not incorporating the manure into the soil, you're actually losing 50% of the nitrogen that you're applying into the air. And so there's a price to pay for being no-till in that case, and manure becomes much less effective input. And so you have to sort of, I think about how you can balance, again, the effects of tillage versus the benefits of incorporating that animal manure into the soil. And you saw in the comparisons in the field trial systems that a little bit of tillage to incorporate manure and maybe some cover crop biomass actually increases the microbial activity and decreases compaction, and ends up creating actually a much healthier soil than you would by not tilling it in. And so I would say in general that a no-till system with cover crops and manure is less effective in terms of soil health than incorporating at least a little bit of tillage in that case.
Yeah, totally second all of what you said. I think nutrient cycling is one of the main reasons why organic farmers cannot really afford to never till. And Nick, you brought up that great information that a lot of the nutrients will be lost if you don't incorporate your manure. And here is a good chart that I like to use. It's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Pest Management Program. I think it's an older publication, but I think it's still pretty relevant. And they have, it's a nice, like, you can have it laminated and it has a bunch of different information on manure. So definitely encourage taking a look at it. So you have the different types of manure and then the time to incorporation. So you can see that within an hour, let's say liquid dairy manure, within an hour, you would get 12 units. If you wait between an hour and 3 days to incorporate it, you lose 2 units. And if you incorporate it like this more than 3 days after applying it, then you have a substantially less amount of nitrogen available. And so a lot of it is just lost to the air, I believe, although I'm not an expert in nutrient cycling, but I think it's volatilization of the nitrogen is what's happening here. So that will be a bigger or smaller phenomenon depending on the type of manure you're using, as you can see here. But yeah, I would definitely not encourage doing too much of spreading manure without incorporating it.
Yeah. And if you're looking at, you know, the energy impacts of your farming system, or you're concerned about your greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, I think the losses from not incorporating manure would far exceed, you know, the tillage operations that you might need to have in your system in order to incorporate those. I don't know the exact numbers on those, but it's just something that sort of stands to reason in my mind, that I think that there would be much more benefit to, you know, to reducing greenhouse gas emissions or the energy efficiency of your farming system to incorporate rather than to leave it in that case.
Thank you. Yeah. Since we had a question on nutrient management, we have 10 minutes left, so I'm jumping to the nutrient management planning section. Here is kind of an example of the typical Midwestern organic rotation: corn, soybean, small grain. Potentially the small grain is underseeded with a clover, which adds a little nitrogen here, more or less depending on how long you let the clover be. And if you look at the crop needs, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, focusing on the nitrogen because that's kind of the one that's like the hardest, the one need that's the hardest to meet. The two other tend to be, when you're using manure particularly, tend to be in abundance and actually have too much of it. So that would be a good consideration to look that you're not applying too much of it. So for 150 bushel corn, roughly 150 units of nitrogen. For 90 bushel winter wheat, roughly 110 units of nitrogen. Soybeans obviously do not need nitrogen as they are legumes. So if we kind of like go through the motion of like doing the math, let's say we have our red clover that's before corn. So hopefully we're going to get some credits from it to meet that 150 units needed. We look at this table. This is from Penn State Extension. They also have an amazing guide on how to plan your nutrients, how to do your nutrient management planning in an organic rotation, including with cover crops. So if we look at the red clover line here, depending on the dry matter that you will get, so you know, if you terminate it a couple months after wheat harvest, you're not going to have a lot of biomass. But if you let it grow all the way into the spring, you will have accumulated a lot of biomass, including the one that goes into the winter and the new biomass that grows in the spring. So having, measuring it, it's easy to like clip some clover, make a quadrat of like 1 square foot, clip it and dry it like in your garage, in your house, anywhere, and weigh it to see how much biomass did I actually have, because that can make an insane difference to have a tiny little bit of clover or a huge amount of clover. So in that range of biomass, you will get that range of total nitrogen, 70 to 150, but then available, because everything is not available right away, you will only have 30 to 60 units of nitrogen. So if we wanted to have a legume only system, we see that in terms of available nitrogen, the year after the clover, when we plant our corn, we have less than half of what the corn needs to grow. So corn may just not be a great option in a system where you don't have manure. And then if we look at the mineralization and immobilization rates of different types of cover crops, because it's also, this availability here will come from that quite a lot. And that depends a lot on their carbon to nitrogen ratio. The higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, the lower the availability of the nitrogen and the more immobilization. So you will actually have nitrogen taken away from your crop by those added materials. If you add feather meal, for example, or grass hay, the corn stalk, those will take nitrogen away from your crop, because the microbes, to break those materials down, will need to consume nitrogen in order to produce nitrogen further. So you want to be, if you want to feed your crop, you really want to have something that has a high mineralization rate or a C/N ratio here that's lower than 15. So you have, like those tender grasses, the young grasses, the clover, the vetch, the peas, and then as like added inputs, the blood, the fish meal, and the soybean meal. Those have really low C/N ratio, but they're very expensive per pound of nitrogen. So no farmer can actually rely 100% on those inputs to grow a full crop of corn, for example. This is a fun tool that has been developed by Penn State Extension. You can plug a lot of information here. Here I highlighted, and I think I should read it, that this nitrogen fertilizer recombination tool is currently under research, and the interface is provided for educational purpose only. The recombination needs to be validated through further field experimentation. So I would not take it as a prescription, but I would take it as a tool to kind of learn and understand the nitrogen dynamics in your system, depending on your corn yield goal, your soil type, the amount of organic matter that you have in your soil, and the type of cover crop that you're growing, whether it's winter kill, or if it's something that overwinters and you will have some spring biomass, and then the C/N ratio. So all those things that we discussed in the previous slides, you would kind of have to have an idea of those metrics in order to get the supplemental nitrogen needed in your specific scenario. So highly encourage playing with that tool, because I think it's very educative. Nick, do you want to go into soil building principles?
Yeah, so well, I mentioned this earlier, but keeping the ground covered with living plants as much as possible should be sort of your main goal when you're thinking about sequencing your crop rotation and putting cover crops in and figuring out how to fit that puzzle together. That's sort of an overarching goal that you can use to think about that. And then it gets into your choices of crops. There's, in terms of soil building and their ability to do that, perennial grasses, obviously like a pasture type system, are going to be at the very top of the list, but that's not, going to be, part of a cropping system necessarily. And so your deep-rooted legumes like sweet clover and alfalfa are going to be at the top of the list in a grain cropping system. And we talked about, carbon and nitrogen ratios there. one of the reasons why I list sweet clover and alfalfa specifically there is that when you can grow a pretty high amount of biomass, especially with sweet clover, and let it grow into maturity, and it still has a low enough carbon to nitrogen ratio that represents a fairly ideal diet for the soil microbes that are going to be breaking it down. And so those two crops are really kind of the all stars of in a legume type system. And so those are kind of at the top of the list. You've got, after that, you have some of your other small grains and other annual grasses. And then you get into crops like some broadleaf crops like buckwheat and things like that. And then at the bottom of the list are your row crops like corn and soybeans that are actually more destructive of soil tilth rather than being anything that builds it. And so you have to also think about in your system how you're going to pay your soil back for those years that you're growing row crops, and designing a rotation that has, I think, less years of row crops than annual grasses or deep-rooted legumes, or less time. You could think about it in terms of time instead of and just total time instead of just years as well. But one of the other principles here is to think about, I mentioned, in my crop rotation stuff earlier, every third year I had in that sequence a biomass of green manure that was being incorporated in either sweet clover or alfalfa or sorghum Sudan grass legume mix. There's all kinds of other options out there too, but that's really what's sort of necessary to build soil in a grain cropping system, especially one that has row crops like corn in it that are taking quite a bit out of the soil. And I mentioned here the role of lignin. And so that's sort of mature plant material, is lignified plant material. It's stable in the soil, so you can build a stable soil humus. And what happens is the microbes can digest it, but they digest it a little bit slower, or at a little bit slower rate. And so you have sort of this slow, sustainable nitrogen release that can take place over the following 2 years after that crop of, say, sweet clover is terminated. And so you're combining that slow release with a carbon sequestration function in the incorporation of that mature plant material. It's going to have more carbon in it than some of the younger plant materials that you could incorporate, for instance. That's going to contribute to your carbon cycling in the soil, which drives your nutrient cycling as well. And so having those in the rotation, Leah mentioned this earlier, really, it seems like you're not making a profit off of it that year, that farmers look at it that way fairly often. But Leah mentioned that actually that can be a really profitable part of your rotation, because it's making the rest of the crops in your rotation that much more successful. And so there's a portion of profit from each crop that you can attribute to the soil building year in your rotation. And that's really how much it's worth. And it's hard to do the math on that and figure out what it is. But if you didn't have that in your rotation, you could figure out what the loss is. And sometimes it's pretty great. These also, in terms of, we're talking about in terms of soil health and nutrient cycling here, but in terms of weed control, it's extremely important as well. So all this stuff sort of ties together, and the principles for building soil are also helping you accomplish effective weed control and nutrient cycling.
Thank you. We're getting to the top of the hour here, and yeah, I think we can, oops, sorry. I think we can wrap it up here. We haven't covered everything, but we have covered quite a bunch, and I don't know what you can see as I'm sharing my screen. Nick, what do we see here? And I can't find the sharing anymore. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Is what's happening.
Right, yeah.
Okay. All right, I just wanted to. Share this. All right. Do we see our contact slide now?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, we can wrap it up here. That was kind of not extremely organized, us coming up with our own questions way of showing our different approaches to different issues that are faced, that a lot of organic farmers are facing. But we would totally encourage you to give us a call. So our team, we have a team of 12 consultants now that are across the entire country, not only in the Midwest. We have people in New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Minnesota with Nick, Colorado, New Mexico, California, and perhaps soon to be Washington. So that's very exciting. We have people all over with all sorts of expertise who are always very willing to talk to farmers and teach and learn from them. And we work very collaboratively among us because of those different skill sets that we all have. And so if you have any questions, just please don't hesitate to reach out. Don't be intimidated by our consultant title. I know for me, it's kind of, it feels like it's going to cost me too much money if I see a consultant, but we don't charge right away. It actually takes us, a few meetings to kind of assess how much help you would need from us. If it's just a one-off question, we'll definitely not charge you for that. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. Those are our cell phone numbers. If you want to text us, that's fine as well, or shoot us an email or give us a call. More than happy to help you with your journey towards organic or within organic and improving your organic practices. Thank you very much for attending today.
Thanks, everyone.